In this lesson, we're going to talk about parent and child components. Our applications are going to be much more complex than just having a single component, myInfo, for example, rendered to the DOM. Instead, you're going to have a complex hierarchy of components that eventually lead down to JSX elements. I'm going to start from scratch here just for repetition's sake, so bear with me. Take a second to see if you can remember what the next step is. You can start with something simple like getting Hello World as an H1 to show up in our browser. In order for anything to show up on the page, we need to use React DOM.render. First parameter is what we want to render, so maybe H1. With Hello World. And the second parameter is where do we want to put that? Which will be in an element called root in our index.html. If any of that's confusing, make sure to go back and review some of the previous lessons, but I'll assume that that makes sense from now on. If I refresh my browser, I get Hello World. But we've moved past this so far. Instead of having an H1 here, we put myInfo in last time. Instead, this time around, let's create a component called app. And app is going to be an entry point into our entire application. In order for this not to fail, we need to import app. And in order for this not to fail, because that component doesn't exist yet, we need to create it. So I'm going to create a file called app.js. Notice it has a capital A because it's a React component. In app.js, I need to remember always to import React. And before I forget, I'm going to export default app. Of course, at this point, app doesn't exist. So let's create it. Before I put anything in the return, I'm going to refresh the browser really quick. And notice that there's a problem. See if you can remember what we need to return here inside of this component. I need some kind of JSX element. So I might put an H1. Says hello again. Refresh. There we go. Or I could put any kind of other HTML in here as well. Maybe a div. Where inside I have an H1. And maybe something like an unordered list. Maybe at this point I decide that I want this to be an actual website and I start putting things together. So this top section might be a nav bar. And below the nav, I might put a main section where most of my content will go. And at this point, I would do something like add some styling to my unordered list so that this was more like a nav bar. As you can see, this app component is getting pretty large, and it's kind of defeating the purpose of React. We talked about how we can take each piece of HTML and put it into its own component. We're not really doing that very well here. Instead, we may decide to create separate components for each little piece of HTML that we need on our page. Take a look at this diagram to get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Here we're rendering the app component, but app may decide to render another component called myInfo, where myInfo may eventually render some kind of regular JSX element. Notice I'm making a distinction between components and elements. Elements are the ones that boil down essentially to regular HTML code. Notice that here I have a lowercase d in div. That's a dead giveaway that this is a regular element rather than a component that I've created. On the other hand, myInfo starts with a capital M, and that helps me understand that this is a component that I've created. You may have heard of how the DOM, or document object model, is oftentimes referred to as a tree, where the HTML element is the most base root of that tree. In our case, we can think of the app component as being the root of this tree. And the app component isn't limited to just rendering myInfo. It could also render, for example, a footer. And that footer could render an actual element called footer, which has all of the HTML relating to our footer in it. And if we have a footer, we naturally probably want some kind of header. I've specified these as awesome header and awesome footer so as not to be confusing with the regular footer element. And just like app is rendering more than one component, header may also render multiple components. For example, a navbar, but also maybe a logo component. And those eventually would need to end up as regular elements of some sort. In this case, an image element and a nav element. Hopefully here you can start to see how our React application could become more and more complex as time goes on. And this is only scratching the surface. So in our sample app here, let's create a little footer really quick. I'm going to create a new file called footer.js with a capital F, as seen here, in which I'll need to import React from React as always. I'm going to export the thing before I even create it, just so that I don't forget. Notice here the difference between the capital F footer and the lowercase f footer. As I mentioned before, the lowercase f footer is the actual element that will get rendered to the screen, whereas the capital F footer is the component that I'm creating. It's just a function with a name. Inside here, I may put, I don't know, an H3 says this is my footer. I've created this component, but notice it's not showing up on our page. That's because our app is not rendering a footer anywhere. I need that footer in this file in order to create an instance of it. So I'm going to import footer from /footer. And maybe right under my main section, I'll include the capital F footer that I just imported. We refresh this now. Here's my footer element. At this point, I have kind of a strange mixture of elements that are regular JSX elements being mixed in with components that I have here. If I can, I really like to have this app component almost be like a table of contents, where instead of having some elements and some components, it's mostly just components. So this might look like this: header, main content, and footer. And then I can go to each of those individual components and see what elements those are rendering. Now, header and main content don't actually exist, but the point is you can continue to nest your components as deeply as you need. We're going to get a chance to practice this in the upcoming lesson, but if you'd like, you can spend some time trying to fix this code. Since header and main content currently don't exist, go ahead and create them. Also, before we move on, feel free to click in the blue slides in the lower left to check out that diagram once again. Once you feel pretty comfortable, let's move on to the practice.